So, recently, physicists celebrated the discovery of the boson, and this is considered to be the God particle. Without it, matter would not come together, galaxies would not come together, the Earth, ourselves would not exist. In a way, that makes the impossible possible. And when you look at the expectations that we put on teachers, government puts on teachers, you think of them as being God particles of some kind. People were expected to make the impossible possible. And this began not now, but way back in 1822, where we could find the first recorded act of government intervention in the normal use of languages by the population. On that photo, you have Lord Somerset, who was the governor of the Cape Colony between 1814 and 1826. On the 5th of April, 1822, he introduced what is now known as the English Language Proclamation. In a single swift move, he made English the official language of the Cape Colony, and therefore, putting an onset of an era or centuries of government interventions in how people should use languages and what languages they should use. And interestingly enough, when he issued the English Language Proclamation, the number of competent English speakers in the Cape Colony was insignificant. More than 90% of people in the Cape Colony spoke languages other than English. What he thought was that for this to be a viable policy and eventually to take us to where we are today, he needed to do two things. The one thing was to try and boost the population of English speakers in the Cape Colony, and that was through encouraging migrations from England to the Cape Colony. And another intervention was in terms of bringing teachers from Ireland. And these teachers would come, with the knowledge of Dutch that would have learned in Holland and English, to come and be sort of an army to transform the Cape into eventually a functional English language environment. But we all remember the Soweto uprisings, which sort of sent a strong message to government and whoever was in power that people are not always passive and willing to take on any initiatives in terms of intervening with normal use of language or their own language preferences. After that came the Constitution, or should I say, the constitutions. I said earlier on that in 1822, Lord Somerset, unchallenged, went ahead and proclaimed English to be the language of the Cape. And what our Constitution did initially was to try to offset that kind of interventionist, dictatorial way of policing language, and adopting this view of the government of the people, by the people, a government which would be listening to the people and ultimately doing the will of the people. And that's why it is important to look at our current constitution in the light of the interim constitution of 1993. This is what section 3.3 of the interim constitution says. Whenever practicable, a person shall have the right to use and to be addressed in his or her dealings with public administration at a national level of government in any official South African language of his or her choice. So the onus is kind of on the individual, the citizen, to demand their rights. and ask government to serve them in the language of their own choosing. And I consider that to be the sort of honeymoon phase. Later on, what happened is that governments seem to have abstracted on the initial intentions. And this is what they now say in the current constitution, section 6.3. National and provincial government may use particular languages for the purpose of government, taking into account usage, practicality, expenses, regional circumstances, money, preferences, and in a sense, it's like a kid who's offered this big cake for their birthday, and then they're told, you're not going to touch that birthday cake, you're not going to eat it unless mom says so. I mean, what's the purpose of offering me this big cake if I can't really enjoy it? You know, we find ourselves with this good constitution promising us or giving us a lot of possibilities that we may not really get to enjoy in actual fact. Or picture this. The wedding ceremony, the priest says to the groom, I now declare thee man and wife, but you may not kiss the bride. You may only behold her for the rest of your life. Look at her beauty until death do you part. Impossible. It is absolutely impossible. But in a way, when we look at the South African Schools Act, we see that the Act confers to the school governing bodies the power to determine the language policy of a particular school, taking into account the Constitution, which in effect seems to deny us some of the rights that it seems to offer us, but also taking into account the Act itself and other applicable provincial laws. Now I want to zero in on case law. In layman terms, we say that case law refers to the ruling of judges, and this is important because whilst on the one hand, promulgated laws, orders, and statutes tell you what you can do, what you can get, what you're entitled to, what case law does is that it looks at the practical enactment of those rights, and therefore tells you whether you indeed can enjoy those rights. So it's a practical interpretation of promulgated laws, statutes, and ordinances. And this is important because the judges' rulings become laws in themselves, and that later rulings must apply or must take into account previous rulings. And in a good constitutional democracy, there should not be any kind of conflict between statutes and laws that are promulgated and the findings and the rulings in practical cases. Let's look at some. The first case I want to focus on is the Middleburg Primary School versus the head of department, Mpumalanga Department of Education. What happened in that case is that the provincial department forced a single medium Afrikaans primary school to admit 26 learners to grade 1 and asked that these learners be taught in English. And the school said, no, we're an Afrikaans school. We're not going to offer English as a medium of instruction. We wanted to remain Afrikaans. And then eventually the matter was taken to court, and Judge Beltesman found that the actions of the Mpumalanga Department of Education were in contravention with the South African Schools Act. The second case I want to look at is the Western Cape Minister of Education versus Micro Primary School. What happened in that case is that the governing body of this other Afrikaans medium school had refused to accede to an order of the Western Cape Department of Education to change the language policy, converting this time around an Afrikaans medium school into a parallel medium English and Afrikaans school. And the school said, no, we're an Afrikaans medium school, we will remain an Afrikaans medium school. The matter was taken to court, and Judge Thring ruled that to switch from a single medium school to introduce English as a second language would indeed have a profound influence on the customs and traditions and almost every aspect of the atmosphere which pervades in the school. Third case. This is the case of Ebro School versus Mpumalanga Department of Education. The Mpumalanga Department of Education made a controversial decision to withdraw the school governing body's competency to determine the school's language policy, because there seems to be a stumbling block all the time that you want to make a rule. So what you do eventually is that you just remove that right from them and then hope that you're going to get what you want. Unfortunately, this matter was fought to the bitter end. It went all the way up to the Constitutional Court, and this was a ruling of the Constitutional Court. The part in red says, the Schools Act authorizes only the governing body to determine the language policy of an existing school, and nobody else is empowered to exercise that function. What we see in actual fact is that the South African Schools Act seems to defeat the intended purpose of achieving the ideals of laying a strong foundation for democratic transformation, combating discrimination and intolerance. And on the other hand, we see that the school governing bodies act as gatekeepers to maintain the status quo of the schools. As a consequence, we see here the percentage of learners by language of learning and language of teaching, and these are the latest statistics from the Department of Education, and they're dated back to 2007. So it's not very clear. Actually, it is. Oh, that's what you can see. That's great. All right. You can see that apart from Afrikaans and English, which enjoy some kind of an increase in the number of learners who have them, both as mother tongue and language of learning and teaching, we see here that in grade 1 for Afrikaans you have 9.5%, and in total in South Africa you have sort of an increase to 11.9%, of learners who have Afrikaans as language of learning and teaching. English enjoys the best part of the cake, so to say, in that, to begin with, there's only a handful of people who have English as the language of learning and teaching in grade 1. And then by grade 12, it's 1%, and in general, in South Africa, it's about 65.3%. And when you look at all these other languages, there is a serious decline from grade 1 to grade 12 and in the general population. I took a pleasure at looking at the gains that we've made since 1998. I looked at statistics of languages of teaching and learning per category as it appears there compared to 2011. There hasn't been any except for English and Afrikaans. Is there any hope? Is there any hope for what we're talking about, the kind of things we're talking about? Language and learning across the curriculum, when we see that it's only Afrikaans mainly, or English mainly, and Afrikaans that seem to make it as language of learning and language of teaching. I think that we have to rethink the way we look at the debates or the discussions on language and learning across the curriculum. Because wherever I am, wherever I go with my languages. If the school denies my language or any of my languages to be the language of learning and teaching, it doesn't mean that that language fades away from me. It is with me. It remains with me. And therefore, we should think of ways in which we can enhance, support, and develop languages across the curriculum, rather than language understood to be the language of learning and teaching. And I think we should also embrace fully the concept of multiple intelligences. Unlike the way intelligence was thought of initially to be sort of a monolithic block, you either have it or you don't have it, you're intelligent or you're not. recent developments in educational psychology and even in language teaching methodologies do acknowledge that we have at least 7 types of intelligences. You know, these range from your linguistic intelligence to your mathematical and logical intelligence to your visual intelligence to your musical intelligence to your movement intelligence to your interpersonal intelligence and even interpersonal intelligence. And happily enough, I looked at the CAPS document, they seem to cater for other kinds of intelligences apart from the mathematical and logical intelligence together with the linguistic intelligence. So there is hope there. And we have therefore to think of which languages to support, use and sustain in developing other kinds of intelligences apart from the mathematical, logical, as well as linguistic intelligence. The reality though remains, staring at us right in our faces. Most of our learners learn through the medium of first additional or second additional language, which has got ways of affecting the comprehension of content subjects, as well as their ability to grasp competently with other learning areas.